Stefanos Tsitsipas was struggling physically and mentally through most of his 2025 season with low back pain. He has since returned in 2026 to Australia and he is currently pain-free and in decent form. I'm Monica, a sports physio. Let's explore what potential complex back injury Tsitsipas was experiencing and why the serve would have bothered him the most. Now, to really understand what issues Tsitsipas may have had in his lower back, let's go through the lumbar spine a bit more. So your lumbar spine consists of 5 vertebrae. They are larger and thicker compared to the other vertebrae in your spine, so compared to your middle back and in your neck. The reason being is your lumbar spine is responsible for taking most of the load and the weight bearing that goes through our spine. So it transmits and absorbs the load from our legs into the back. Your back is a strong structure. It's designed to move. And when we look at the design of your lumbar spine, it's really good at resisting the compressive loads more than the torsional loads. And the L5-S1 is then usually the segment that takes most of the load as it's then near the tailbone, and then the legs are transmitting the load through your tailbone onto your lumbar, and the first bit is the L5-S1. And then between each vertebrae you've got your discs, and the discs are larger in the lower back because the vertebrae themselves are larger for that weight bearing role. And the role of the disc is it actually absorbs the shock that goes through and it distributes the load more evenly, as well as helps to provide us with flexible movement. And then either side of the spine, at each spinal segment, you have nerves that exit out to then innervate your muscles and to provide us with sensation. Now that we've got a bit of understanding on the lower back, let's go through the different phases of the serve to then see how this can link with low back pain. The first phase is your preparation phase, which is from the start of your serve to your ball toss, where you end up into that trophy position. Then you move into the second phase, which is what we call the cocking phase, and it's from when you're in your ball toss position and you go into what we call maximal external rotation in your shoulder. From this cocking position, you then have your acceleration phase. So you're going from this maximal external rotation position and accelerating through to impact the ball. And from the impact of the ball, you then go into what we call your deceleration phase, where you're then trying to slow your arm down. And that deceleration phase is typically classed as going from the ball impact into maximal shoulder internal rotation. And then once you've achieved that maximal shoulder internal rotation, from that point to the end of your serve is then what's considered your follow through. And most of the time where you get the low back pain is in that cocking phase and in the acceleration phase. So you're pretty much in that lumbar extension, you're side bent and rotated, and let's say if you're a right-handed player, like that to your right, and then you're rapidly releasing the energy that's stored in that position and you're reversing it. So you're going from that extension and side bend to the right, so then go to your left and going forward into that flexion position. And you're probably thinking, well, that's how all tennis players serve. So why do some players get back pain and then some players don't? So let's go into this right now. Relating this back to Stefanos, he hasn't fully disclosed what the injury or the pathology was in his back. I did have a look though, there was some chat about potentially being some edema or swelling in the back. And if this is the case, we could assume that there was like a bone stress response there. Now, a bone stress injury, it's a continuum. So when you have a bone stress initially, it starts off as swelling in the vertebrae. And if you're to continue loading, it can then lead into what we call like a stress fracture. So a bone stress reaction or like that edema is like the early stage of this. And then the edema can normally come in when there has been excessive load more than what the bone can handle. So then you start getting that inflammatory response happening and you get the swelling in the vertebrae. It's important too, an MRI is the gold standard to pick this up. If you did an X-ray early on, it won't usually show anything because the X-ray will only show you once it's at the end stage of the injury, which is where you get that fracture line. So really important, MRI is the way to go. It will pick up that early reaction. So with a bony injury, it is really painful. Normally as you play, like let's say continue to play tennis, the pain will typically get worse. Like it doesn't tend to get better, and it can be really sore at night and in the morning because of that inflammatory response. And bony stress will normally come on with that repeated extension and rotation, like in your serve, and affects the segment what we call your pars interarticularis, which is just a part of your vertebrae. And usually it's the L5-S1 that's most affected in this, so the L5 is then coming down onto the S1. For a right-handed player like Tsitsipas, the left side is the one that normally gets affected, as from that lumbar hyperextension position and right side bend, you're then moving rapidly into a left side bend and into that forward flexion position. And this means that top vertebrae is then coming down onto the bottom vertebrae on that left side. This then puts a lot of side bending forces onto that left side, especially when it's repeated and there's not as much recovery. So there are a few different risk factors that will place a player developing a bony injury in their back during the set. So for instance, having that excessive lumbar extension, so that hyperextension, and this can result as a compensatory thing. So if you've got less thoracic extension or rotation, so your middle back, and also a little bit lower at that thoracolumbar junction. The other thing can also be if you've got limited hip extension. So if, let's say, there's any hip flexor issues and flexibility problems, it will then limit how much your hip can go back. And again, that will then load your lower back a lot more. Other things like that premature opening of the hip. So when you're in that cocking phase, the hip is then facing the net a bit more than it should. Having insufficient leg drive will also load your lower back more, and something that we call the maximal separation angle, which is the position where your shoulder is positioned in relation to your hip in that cocking phase. Now this won't be really fair, but we're going to do a comparison of Tsitsipas' serve against the GOAT's serve. So these videos, they're both serving to the backhand side and they're going to be serving down the tee here. In that trophy position first up, the difference between Tsitsipas' position and Federer, Tsitsipas looks like he is in way more lumbar extension here compared to Federer. And then whether this hyperextension is driven from a restriction higher up in his back or whether, there's any hip issues as well, but we can definitely see that there is a lot more extension at the back. If we look at the maximal separation angle between the two players, you can see that Stefanos' angle is a lot greater. So if we look at where the shoulder is in relation to the hip, you can see the shoulders are rotated back a lot more. And they have found that players with low back pain compared to those without back pain have a greater angle. Given that Tsitsipas is in way more lumbar extension and he's got that greater angle, as he then comes to follow through, what is interesting is his finish position compared to Federer's position. So he looks like he's actually falling to the left, and so that's putting a lot more load onto the left side of his lower back. Other things that can cause significant pain are like a nerve injury or irritation. So you can get what we call radicular pain, where you get radiating sort of electric shooting pain down the leg. And this is often if there is some sort of inflammation or irritation around the nerve from some sort of mechanical or chemical trigger. And then you can also get what we call radiculopathy. The difference between radiculopathy and radicular pain, though, is that you don't necessarily have pain with radiculopathy. It is where there's a compression of the nerve where it causes a conduction loss. So you tend to see weakness, numbness, a loss of reflexes. So if Stefanos did have conduction nerve issues with the pain will typically get better first before the weakness and the sensation. And if there's a disc injury involved, the disc injury can then actually irritate the nerve as it then creates more inflammation there. Or the disc can actually physically contact and compress a nerve root, and that could potentially lead to any conduction loss symptoms. So the last question is, how did Tsitsipas manage to get back into form for 2026? So he would have undergone a significant rehab process. He has denied having surgery, but it sounds like he has had some injections to help him along the way. So from what I've read, he has had 2 corticosteroid injections just before the Davis Cup. So the corticosteroid injections would have helped to manage that inflammation and the swelling in the area. He also supposedly had what we call a percutaneous epidural injection, which is an injection they do to assist with any acute nerve pain that's there. Other things that would have been really closely monitored are things like his sleep, his nutrition, his training loads, and making sure that he isn't overloading himself to then cause any re-flare-ups of his back pain. And in terms of the rehab process, it's normally guided by his symptoms, and a lot of elite teams will also use MRI to see where the bone healing is at as to when to progress into phases. This is assuming that there was a bony swelling present. So if there was, there are 3 phases of rehab. The first phase being protect. So you normally minimize any high impact activities, so no tennis, and you're trying to limit and avoid that extension and rotation in that lumbar spine. So often under load, exercises will be done in a relatively neutral position. You can still work on your squat and lunge technique and your upper body strength, but keeping in mind that if you are going to be doing anything overhead for your shoulders and shoulder blade, there is still a chance that your lower back can go into some extension. So you may decide to keep the exercises below shoulder height in this phase. Walking can then be done like every second day, day to ensure the bone has some time to heal. And as long as all of these exercises are done symptom-free, then they are safe to do. As clinical signs are pain-free, and in elite teams, if they redo the MRI and there's substantial bone healing that's present, they'll often transition into phase 2, which is protected reloading. You're increasing your resistance and your load, so you might be going from running to on-court movements to like shadow hitting of ground strokes to then shadow serving, to then doing more extension and loaded base activities like your ball slams. As serving is often a trigger, you want to be really gradual in your serving progressions. So you may start first with doing serves from the service line before going to the baseline. And typically you'd start with increasing volume first before intensity. So with your volume, making sure that, let's say you're doing like 10 to 15 at a time and you have some break within that session before repeating some more serves. You might often do your serves like every alternate day, because if you're doing consecutive days, that might not give enough time for the bone to heal at that point in time. It's good to then allow at least 4 weeks to build each progression. And then once you've sort of worked on building your volume, you can then look to build your intensity over at least a month block. And with intensity, it may not necessarily be your serve speed, but also the type of serve. So you might go from starting into a flat serve before doing your kick serves. The serve is normally the hardest bit to manage with these bony issues, so it can be at least like a 3-month time frame to build into your full serving. This then leads into the last phase, which is your return to sport phase, and often the team and the coach will work closely together to ensure that the progressions into full training and match play is done appropriately and there's good recovery for the bone as well. It is great to see Tsitsipas back already in 2026 and feeling pain-free. I really hope that he can continue the rest of the year without any issues with his back. Thanks so much for listening. I'm really excited for the AO. I really hope there's no injuries that happen, but if there are, I'll be sure to do future videos on those.